Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Lynn O'Hara, and I'm the Director of Programs at National History Day. So excited to be here for our fifth and final of our 2015-2016 Ask the Expert Hangout series. And tonight we're going to be talking about documentaries. A couple guests that we have with us. Al Wheat is joining us. Al is a teacher and one of the co-coordinators of NHD in Mississippi. We are also lucky enough to have Randy Nissen with us. Randy is a teacher at Toledo Early College High School in Toledo, Ohio, and he's there with a group of his high school students, and they'll be asking us questions. What I want to make sure that you know is that for everyone who is watching us live, we are live. You can use Twitter to ask us questions. Use the hashtag NHD Hangouts. Make sure to put the S on the end. We'll watch those, and we also have a lot of pre-registration questions that students sent in. What I'd like to do is go ahead and turn things over to Peter Frestet from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Peter, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Lynn. And I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight as well. Before we get started, I'd like to say a few words about NEH. So the National Endowment for the Humanities is a federal grant-making agency that funds research, preservation, and education in the humanities, of which history, of course, is an important part. NEH supports a wide range of activities, including the creation of books, museum exhibitions, and documentary films, like the one we'll discuss tonight. NEH also has a long history with National History Day, which we have supported and it's found the first place NEH Scholar medals at the national contest, and we also offer a special prize for excellent use of the historic newspapers found in Chronicling America. Chronicling America is a free online database that includes over 10 million pages of digitized historic American newspapers. Edcitement, our education website at edcitement.nih.gov, is also a key resource for teachers and students. Edcitement has over 500 lesson plans and 400 vetted websites and a How to Use Chronicling America portal with specially commissioned NHD lessons and more. One other resource available to teachers is the summer programs NEH offers every year, which provide opportunities for teachers to study a variety of humanities topics. Information about these programs and more can be found at NEH's website, nih.gov. Now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's presenter, Ian McCluskey. Ian is the founder of Northwest Documentary and lives in the Pacific Northwest. He also directed the NEH-funded film for joining us tonight, Ian.
Thanks for having me.
Ian, we're so thrilled to have you joining us, and I know that what a lot of the things that our students are doing right now in producing their 10-minute NHD documentaries is really a lot of what you do on a bigger scale when you produce your documentaries. Can you talk a little bit about why you love making documentaries?
Sure, I'd love to. Documentary filmmaking is something that I discovered by accident. During school, I just fell in love with it, and I love it because it allows me to get to know people that I normally wouldn't get to meet in my everyday life. It's like a passport into other people's lives, and I like to, it also allows me to go places I never would be able to get to, other countries, down wild and scenic areas of the American West, and it also acts like a time machine for me. It allows me to go into the past, and it allows me to touch and experience the lives of people that lived before me and otherwise that I wouldn't get to know in my own day and time. So I really love it. I think it's one of the most powerful tools, one of the most powerful art forms, and it keeps me engaged and entertained, and I just can't wait to tell more stories and have other people help tell stories too.
Excellent. One of the things that I know a lot of times our students get to a point where they get stuck. They do a lot of research, they know an awful lot about their topic, but they're not quite sure how to approach the idea of transitioning from research to product. Can you talk a little bit about how you approach the process of documentary making and how you work in your organization?
All right, well, kind of the way that I work is I didn't go to a fancy film school, and I don't work, I work for a small arts nonprofit and as an independent. So I don't work for a large studio, and I don't often have a large budget to start with. So everything that I do starts with an idea, and then usually that idea I get very enthusiastic about it, and I'll tell one of my good friends about it, and they'll get excited, and then there'll be two of us excited, and then we'll tell a third person, and then there'll be three of us excited, and it's a snowball effect, and that's how we generate interest, and that's how we raise funds. That's how we get gear together. It's I would say it's collaborative. It's DIY in the DIY model of do it yourself, and it's pieced together through kind of begging, borrowing, stealing whatever we can, using sort of the resources at our means. And I might not always be able to afford the newest or nicest camera, or afford to fly around in jets and get the cool effects that maybe the larger Hollywood studios can. But I like it because it's me, my friends, professionals who can go out on weekends and tell untold stories, and that we do it necessarily without having to do a budget. We just come up with an idea and with passion pursue it, and pursue it the way that anyone pursues a project, a research project. We start off with questions, and we go in search of answers, and those answers usually generate more questions and more questions and more questions, and then eventually we find ourselves in the edit room with a lot of material to piece together.
Well, we'll definitely talk about that. Do you want to talk a little bit about your latest project, and we can try to show the trailer on that one? We'll do our best with the technology here.
Sure. My latest project began just kind of in that similar way. I was in college, and I was driving around Wyoming doing research for a travel book, and I came across a historic marker, travel marker, and on it had three French people who had come to from France to the American West in the middle of the Great Depression back in the 1930s. And they did it for a trip in kayaks to go down a river that was made famous by John Wesley Powell back around just shortly after the American Civil War. And as a history student, as a history lover, I'd never heard of these French people who had come to the West, and I thought it was an interesting story. But it started with kind of a curiosity, and then it led to me wanting to learn more about them and more about them, and that actually led me to want to know so much about them that I had to learn how to kayak so that I could go down the river the way they went down the river in search of their story. So the film's called Voyagers Without Trace, and this little trailer that we're going to watch is, I think, about 2 minutes, and hopefully if it plays, it will show some of the original footage that they shot and some of the original footage that we shot in our film, and tell the story of that.
Excellent. Let's go ahead and give that a shot.
You know those stories where the young kid finds a treasure map in an attic? Or a lost letter in an old book? I always dreamed one day I'd find a mysterious clue. This is the photo that started my adventure.
Il voulait fuir cette vie trop confortable. Il tombe amoureux du voyageur et il lui dit: je suis convaincu que l'on peut descendre le Colorado River en kayak. Les Américains jusqu'à maintenant ont essayé, mais avec des grosses embarcations. Et dis-moi d'accord.
So few people had been down the river in those days, there was really no one they could turn to. And there was really no way out. If you had any kind of problem, you were just totally on your own.
What if the river still has traces of their expedition, just waiting to be uncovered?
As soon as I saw this, I was like, oh my.
Maybe the Voyagers Without Trace left us just enough.
If there's a diary, maybe it's still in existence.
We are part of this treasure hunt, this history detective mission.
That's a really cool project. I'm excited about that, and I'm excited about some of the examples that we can talk about kind of out of that trailer with students. But can you talk, one of the things that you mentioned that, you've got to kind of do the best you can with what you have. Can you talk about some of the challenges you end up facing as a producer or a director and how you overcome them?
Kind of starting off with the low budget, one of the things that we do is we borrow gear, we borrow resources. I shoot a lot on locations in national parks and national forests. And so the picture that's up right now is a picture of me with a homemade car rig in the Ochiko National Forest and a 1938 car that we used for a reenactment for a film called Eloquent Nude. And some of the challenges basically are how to be resourceful with limited tools, and I think that's something that I had to learn as a student, being starting off with student projects, and I think it's probably hopefully very relevant to the students of the audience who are watching, is that you don't necessarily need large budgets to make movies. And one of the challenges that we just putting together films with small budgets, and one of the things that we did for Voyagers is we traveled down the river, the Green River from Wyoming into Utah and down into the Colorado River and into Arizona, and we spent 31 days on the river with a 8-person all-volunteer team. So it was all volunteers. We were doing research. We stopped into small towns. We went to museums. We interviewed people along the river, and we just were trying to gather everything that we could about this story. And one of the challenges was that the people who had originally lived and experienced the story in the 1930s were no longer alive. Another thing that was challenging is that pieces or documentations were scattered into different archives and sometimes unmarked. And another challenge was just being able to be on the river for 31 days and protect camera gear from the water and the sand and the elements. So that was quite a challenge, and we had to take our audio recording and our video recording to some pretty remote and wild places. There's one photo, there it is, number 11, where we're in, our audio person is actually in the front of a raft with her boom pole facing a rapid.
That must have been quite a challenge. How did you keep your gear charged up? Did you have to charge batteries every night?
We did. We basically had to bring 2 large marine batteries, the type that boats, motorboats or power boats would have, because they're waterproof and they have heavy charges. And so we had to bring those through the wilderness areas, because in national parks, in designated wilderness, bring any sort of engine or mechanical devices like that. So we had to hook up a battery to an AC converter and try to charge our batteries. But we were often on the river in the wilderness for 7+ days. So at each town we would stop and restore and recharge batteries.
Excellent. Now, I have a question for you. One of the things that students struggle with is that sometimes they choose topics where there's a lot of video available, especially more recent topics. And sometimes they get hooked into a topic where there, might be a few pictures, but not many, or sometimes there's no video because of when it was. What are some ways that you deal with that problem?
Yeah, I think that's one of the hardest and most challenging, and I think the most absolute fun parts of historic documentary to me. I absolutely think it's incredible. But if you're going to pursue historic documentary, it really does mean that primarily the video and film record back to the 40s and 50s, as far as being accessible to a lot of people and having a lot of documentation. Film itself, only goes back a little bit further into history to the 1880s, kind of late 19th century, and photography isn't that much older. So anytime you're, basically filming or doing a documentary of Civil War or earlier, the filmmaker has a shortage of footage to work with visual materials, unlike today. And I think that's one of the hardest parts of working in a visual medium, where there aren't a lot of visuals, and it's also one of the most creative challenges. And I've often enjoyed trying to face that challenge. There's one of the tools that filmmakers quite often turn to is the historic reenactment, where they get props or actors or a combination of actors and props to sort of recreate history or recreate a moment in history that there wasn't film cameras around to witness. And sometimes as a filmmaker we get stuck without anything to show, and so we have to in some ways fabricate a fictitious visual in a nonfiction film. And it's a pretty accepted practice at this point. However, the real question is whether or not it actually looks cheesy or looks authentic. And I think people who have watched a lot of historic documentaries might be able to know what an inauthentic reenactment looks like. And I didn't want to, I've never wanted to try to make an inauthentic reenactment. And with the film Eloquent Nude, this was a story of an American photographer, Edward Weston, and his wife, Karis Wilson. And they lived in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and made some of the greatest photographs in American history. But as a photographer and model and husband-wife team in Germany, and they didn't have a movie camera, they didn't have the ability, they didn't have a GoPro, they didn't have a cell phone to do a bunch of selfies. And so when they were on a road trip making photographs, there's no photographic visuals or film of this important road trip that they took in their life. And as a filmmaker trying to tell the story of this photographer and his wife and how they came together and collaborated to help make some of these amazing photos, I had to create home movies that didn't exist. And so I've got a little clip from the film Eloquent Nude. It comes in about the middle of the film, and this is after the photographer has met, photographer Edward Weston has met Karis Wilson. They've fallen in love with each other. They've made some of their original and early great photos together, and now Karis has helped Edward write a grant to the Guggenheim Foundation to go on a road trip to make photos across the American West. And because Karis is such a good writer, the Guggenheim Foundation gives them the grant and allows the two of them to take off in a Ford V8 and go on a road trip across the West to make photos. So this is a little clip about 2 minutes long describing what they did on that road trip.
We got a Ford V8 we called Jaime on over to Guggenheim.
They developed and perfected a style of functioning that was extremely efficient, extremely simplified.
So they were down to the essentials. There was his camera, his film holders, Karis had her typewriter, and the car to get them to the next location. And that was no more or less than he needed.
Each person had his responsibility, her responsibility, and there was an ease to how they operated together.
We had a wonderful time together and enjoyed the way we moved around and what we did.
They'd come back together at the end of the day, cook a meal and talk. And Karis was not, a third wheel in this. She had something that he wasn't bringing to this relationship. She was the writer. She was producing an element of their work that was unique to her.
She would sit down at the end of every day or midday, depending on what was going on, and put her manual typewriter on the hood of the car and just type up what was happening. And it goes to show you how articulate and literate she is, because There's not any sense that she's whiting things out or rethinking things. She's just going.
I just developed an easy, straightforward style that didn't even seem to be a style at all.
She was doing a travelogue, and it's that sense of travelogue that really gives the text a lot of its charm. You really get a sense of what it's like out there, and just how much fun they're having.
As we went along, the more I did, the more I had confidence in what I could do.
Now, here's a question, Ian.
Okay.
I'm really interested in the way that you did the reenactment there, and we'll talk a little more about that for NHD projects. Do you always do reenactment when you do your films?
No, I don't always, because in nonfiction films in particular, especially if I mean, I kind of feel like there's a scale in documentary that nonfiction is a very broad area, and it has a spectrum between the two goalposts. One goalpost being sort of objectivity, reporting, current events, issue-driven things, scientific documentaries where facts and accuracy, balance, fairness, all the tenets of journalism are very critical. And the other end of the spectrum is more an essay, personal memoir, personal documentary, maybe. Yeah, the idea of like essay, where it's more subjective, it's more personal experience. And so as a filmmaker, I have to think of where I'm situated on that spectrum of objectivity, accuracy, fairness, balance, and what is my intent for the audience's experience. And in films where it's mostly scientific-based, environmental studies, environmental research, and history where the facts have to be accurate, I would shy away from reenactments whenever possible, because they are tools of a fictitious creation. But in films that are more personal in nature, more autobiographical, and more subjective, I really love reenactment because it's where I get to be, as a documentary filmmaker, a little bit more like a fictional filmmaker. I get to have actors and props, and I get to tell them, okay, get in the car, okay, drive here, okay, let's get this shot, let's shoot at this time of day, let's shoot with this location. And part of that is very creative to me. And so I make the choice based on the story itself, first and foremost, and whether or not original or primary materials are available. And I turn to reenactments usually only if there's an absence of them. So if I'm stuck without any original material, then I have to create that material, which was the case in Eloquent Nude. But in the case of the new film, Voyagers Without Trace, I hit the jackpot. It's Edward Weston and Karis Wilson were traveling in the American West in 1938 and didn't have a camera, but the three French kayakers, Bernard, Genevieve, and Antoine, were also in the American West in 1938, and they not only had a film camera, but they had a film camera loaded with color film. And it was color film before even the first Hollywood color movie had even been shot, which is The Wizard of Oz. So they were so ahead of their time. There's a photo of Genevieve from the film. She's using a film camera with color film, shooting their adventures. So I didn't have to recreate actors and try to make them dress and look like it was 1938. I actually had the real people doing the actual trip itself, and we had over 50 minutes of their original footage that we found in an attic in France.
The joys of historical research. You never quite know what you're going to find.
Never know.
Two more questions for you, then we're going to go to our students in Toledo. My one question is, in terms of editing, this is something sometimes our students run into, and NHD documentaries are limited to 10 minutes. We'll talk more about that later. How do you decide what to keep and what to cut, and what ends up on the editing room floor?
Oh my goodness, editing. I mean, that's where the art of storytelling really happens. And I think most students today know that, you know, shorter content, that that you can pack so much into 10 minutes. But for someone like me who's used to 1 hour long documentaries or even 80-minute documentaries, it's really hard to condense and condense and condense. But I think that's the name of the game is, when in doubt, cut it out. If it's not serving the story, cut it, cut it, cut it, cut it. Just keep cutting it. Try to think of fewer words to say it. When I was editing Eloquent Nude, the Voyagers, the very first rough cut was 2 hours long, and now it's 80 minutes. And a version that's going out on the Banff World Festival tour is 46 minutes. So we just keep cutting and cutting and cutting and cutting, trying to get down to the bones of the matter. And usually when it's issue-driven or story-driven, you can usually use plot and kind of the main facts of the events to be the guide. Like, is this part of the story, is this not? But with Voyagers, I actually had a harder time personally for me cutting and finding the story, because we were trying to tell a complicated story where it wasn't just the story of the French trio and their journey from start to finish in 1938, but it was their story in 1938 plus their story after they finished their river trip and returned back to France, what happened to them. And it was also the story, my personal story, of how I found their story, how it inspired me to go learn how to kayak, to go down the river and go after them. And so it was like two ribbons, or like a double helix, weaving together past, present, past, present, past, present. So the film tells their story, then it jumps into my story, it goes back to their story, into my story, to their story, and it has this sort of alternating braid of story narrative. And so that became a real story challenge of trying to figure out what to cut, what to keep, because we couldn't just use facts or story to determine what was a keeper. And in fact, what was important to me was to tell a story, and maybe because I had done other historic documentaries for the last 10 years, so this is a film that I wanted to try something new and different, and I wanted to give a sense of not just the history and the past of what happened to people who are no longer alive, but give a flavor and impression of the people who are alive today in some of the same small towns that the French saw in 1938. Who are the people who are living in these towns? What do they act like? And use the river as sort of the through thread and the united connecting point between these two different time periods. So I've got a funny little clip that some people might say probably shouldn't have made it in the final edit, because it's not really very relevant to the French trio story. It's not very packed full of facts and dates and things, but it's kind of special, and I think it's fun and gives the film a lighter mood and really embraces the spirit of the story rather than the plot of the story. So this one takes place kind of early-ish on in the film, maybe midway through the film, and the French trio come to one little town called Green River, Utah, on the river, and we go to the same town, and so it's a little bit of a story of the two people. There's a melon grower and another a high schooler that we meet in the town, and it's sort of the town as told through their point of view.
Green River, Utah is famous for its melons, and every year they have their annual Melon Days Festival.
Hi, I'm Destiny Holbrook. I'm 17 years old, and I'm Melon Days Queen. Welcome to Green River. Let me show you around. This is the Green River, where the French trio came in 1938. They battled right underneath of our bridge. This is the watermelon float that leads our parade every year. It used to be pulled, but now it is driven, and kids can ride in it. This is the fire station. My grandfather's the fire chief. This is the high school. I go to school here. I am a senior, and there's 22 in our graduating class. The melon stand.
I'm Nancy Donovan. We're in Green River, the center of the Utah desert, and the best melons in the country. I've told people everywhere in the country they can't even stop here because they get sand in their shoes and they won't leave. Green River is a little bit of paradise. Not a whole lot, but a little bit.
I think that's a really interesting piece. That made me smile when we were previewing these earlier. Ian, I have one more question, then we're going to go to our students in Toledo. In NHD, students submit, a lot of times they start with submitting to a school contest, they'll head off to a regional contest, a state or affiliate contest, and on to the national contest if they get lucky. And in between each of those stages, they have the opportunity, if they choose, to revise their work. How important is revision in the process, and what kind of tips or suggestions would you give students once they've got a first cut to get to that final cut?
Oh my God, I think to me revision starts the moment you start thinking of the film and goes all the way past the point of the film being finished, when I personally am like, oh, I wish I could have still changed that. I wish it wasn't too late. But I consider revision not a single moment in the film, but an ongoing, constant. And so, yeah, after they've got a rough cut, one of the things that I always do is I always gather any friend who's willing to look at my work and show them it, and I try to gather the friends who aren't just going to tell me, yeah, that's great, but friends who will really give me their honest opinion. I also sometimes will, more than listen to what they have to say, just watch their reactions as they watch it, listen to the questions that they ask afterwards, whether they're engaged, whether they're confused. Sometimes points of if someone's confused is the most important feedback that you can get, because as the filmmaker who knows everything about the story, it's extremely easy to fall into like the, well, that's obvious state of mind, but to a fresh audience it's never obvious. And so that's why I constantly will have test screenings, test groups, show clips to strangers or to people who have never seen the story, and I won't even explain the story to them. I'll just do a rough cut screening. And as far as what I do with my films is I'll do it with friends, like I said. These friends happen to be mostly filmmakers themselves, but I'll also do it small gatherings, sometimes at restaurants, sometimes at photography stores, sometimes in public libraries, museums, basically any group setting, any organization or group that would host a rough cut screening, I'll say yes to and have a rough cut screening there. I also turn to experts who know a lot more than me. So for Voyagers Without Trace, I turned to a couple historians, some river historians, professors of environmental history, probably half a dozen professors of history and the American West, and I showed them rough cuts and got their feedback notes. So from rough cuts, we do feedbacks, I do advisors, more feedback. I often will show it to other editors and ask other editors' opinions, and it just is an ongoing stage until it's finally done. And then even when it's done, I'm still like, oh, I wish I could have cut that shorter. I wish I didn't hang on to that one clip I was in love with a month ago. I wish I could just cut that and make the story tighter.
Well, I think those are all good tips for our students moving forward, but let's talk to some of our students who are actually in the middle of making their documentary, see if they have questions for Ian or for Al Wheat, our NHD and Mississippi coordinator. So, Mr. Nissen, who do we have?
Okay, hi Lynn, hi Al, hi Ian. I've got at least 3 students who have a question, and our first one will come from a young lady named Vijay.
Hi.
Hello, thanks for joining us. What's your question?
Okay, so I want to know, how do you incorporate music into your video?
Oh, thanks.
This is a big question. We get a lot of questions about music. So, Ian, I'm going to start off with you. What are some ways that you incorporate music? When do you put it in? When do you choose not to put it in?
Oh yeah, I love music in documentary. Music in documentary is really, really fun. Again, I was saying earlier, films that are more factual based maybe have less music, and films that are more fun and personal have more music. And what I like to do is I can get like music that's already recorded, things that I like, popular music, but for legal reasons, for copyright reasons, that's more expensive to use, and it's harder to get legal rights to, especially if I'm going to show it on TV or in a film festival. So I like to ask around to any friend that I know who has any music talent at all and invite them to make original music in my film. And that's been the most fun for me. And literally my very first student film, one of my good friends, I had no idea that she was a talented musician, but she played the flute. And so we got a microphone in a quiet room and turned on the microphone, and I just had her watch the film, and she did some flute music, and it turned out perfectly. I've done the same thing with a friend who plays the guitar. We did a student film where we had someone playing the guitar and someone playing the ukulele, and someone just kind of humming. And to me, that than any music you could use that's already recorded, because no one else will ever have that music in the film except for you. It will be original, and you get to collaborate and work with your friends. And it's amazing how simple music, like just even clapping or snapping or humming or singing a cappella, could really make a unique soundtrack for your film. So that's my advice: is go get some musical friends together and a microphone and show them your film and talk out some ideas and make an original soundtrack.
Thank you.
That's an interesting point. Sometimes when our students are using iMovie, they run into a similar problem because oftentimes it will not allow them to import and use music that is under copyright. So that's a great idea. Although I've mentioned that for NHD students, keep in mind, anybody performing in your documentary doing the music would have to be one of the students in your group. But I'll bet you there's some hidden talent in that group too. So,
yeah.
Excellent. Hi there, what's your name? What's your question?
Hi, my name is Katie. My question I have is, when you're making a documentary, there are certain do's and don'ts. So what should a student stay away from in a documentary? What shouldn't we put in there, and what should we refrain from doing?
That's an awesome question. I'm going to start that question with Ian and then pass it to Al Wheat as well for some tips. What would be something you would tell a student to definitely not do in their documentary? So Ian, go ahead.
Oh boy, that's a tough question. It's a broad question, and it kind of depends on your story. But I would have to say the most important thing is always pay attention to the audio quality when recording, and don't do an interview without headphones or a microphone, because it's going to be really hard to fix that in post production. Good audio is even more important than good video. Good audio will carry bad video, but not the other way around. So I guess number one, do pay attention to audio. It's always underestimated. People always just have their onboard camera and they think this will be fine, or we'll use a filter and clean it up in editing. And so if you can, use a microphone, and if you can't, get your camera really close to the person and get the environment as quiet as possible so that the audio is, number one, clean. So I don't know, I guess that's a technical answer to your question, but that's my best advice, is pay attention to audio.
That's a really good point, and oftentimes our students find that they can get access to a very inexpensive microphone, usually borrowed from a school library or things. Are, a lot of times teachers tend to have that stuff stashed in cabinets, because as a teacher, once you get that, you never give it back. I'm sure the teachers out there know exactly what I'm talking about. Al, what other tips would you give in terms of something not to do with a documentary, or a common mistake that you see?
Just speaking from what I've seen my students do and what I've seen in Mississippi the past few years, don't hang on certain images or shots too long. We are a very ADD culture, and hanging on a shot for 5 to 10 seconds is going to start putting your audience to sleep. So try not to hang on any one image or shot too long. And if you're interviewing someone especially, don't just leave the camera on them. Have some cuts, cut to some footage, cut between yourself and the interviewer. Don't overdo it, but don't just leave, and it just kind of goes back to the whole don't keep one shot in frame for too long. And all of Ian's advice on audio is 100% accurate. Make sure you pay attention to that, because that can really make or break a documentary.
Absolutely. At the end of the day, our judges at all levels always do the best that they can do, but at the end of the day, if they cannot hear you and cannot understand you, it becomes awfully hard to judge you. So thank you for your question. Are there any other questions from Toledo?
Yes, we have one more. Can I add a couple of my don'ts that just drive me crazy?
Please do.
When kids do get a good interview, they just want to put too much of it in their documentary. And I try to tell a kid, okay, we just did a really good 45-minute interview. You might use 12 seconds of it in your entire video, and they don't want to let go of that. And the other thing I hate is when they use all this spiral transitions and all the little toys that come with Final Cut and everything. I wish I could delete that from Final Cut. It drives me crazy. One more question from a young man named Chad.
Absolutely. It's kind of like when you see someone who uses PowerPoint and then makes a noise every time a bullet comes in. It's just not as good an idea as you think it is. So, excellent. Go ahead. What's your next question?
All right, so my next question is, what are some interesting ways to keep an audience interested in a documentary, or just some ways to make your documentary stand out from the rest, to kind of have people remember it better?
Let's do the same thing with this one, because we have all seen a boring documentary, right? It's kind of a joke about social studies teachers and what happens in social studies classrooms. So what are some tips to make your documentary interesting and not put your audience to sleep? Ian, what tip would you give?
All right. Well, I have to say that whenever anyone talk about a documentary, and whether this is at a film festival or whether it's just at lunch and they're saying, "Oh, hey, did you see that one documentary?" or they're online and they're looking either at Netflix or Amazon or whatever, and they're trying to pick out what documentary to watch. I've rarely heard people the polish as the important thing. No, I mean, people will sometimes comment on technique, but technique is always second to story. Story is number one. Story is 99% of documentary. So if you tell a good story that is always kind of asking the question, so what, so what, so what, and telling it in a way that you would tell it to someone yourself and not like a report, that's going to keep audiences engaged. And you can make a very, very simple documentary, and it could have the simplest graphics, it could have the simplest photos, it could have the most basic film work, and if the story is really compelling, then people are going to keep talking about that story for weeks and years and years and years afterwards, because the story ultimately is what people remember. No one's going to remember whether or not you had a cool dissolve or a cool transition or a cool graphic that came up. And in fact, some people might notice and talk about it if it's really annoying. And some people try to take a boring story and put a bunch of transitions and color effects and try to make the polish sell the story. But if there's no story, no matter how much polish you put on it, it won't be interesting. So that goes back to the writing and the revising. And the revising is like, is this a scene? Can the scene be shorter? What is the scene doing in your film? What's the most interesting part of your film? What is the thing, like, is there a moment in your story that's really engaging? Maybe that's your opening. And then you say, oh, this is a really engaging part of the story. Now let's jump back to how the story began and weave people through a tale, almost like a tale that you would read in a storybook. Beginning, middle, and end, good conclusion. And if you have the building blocks of good story, people are going to love it. People will remember it. And no one will be like, what camera was that on? What type of tripod did you have? No one cares at all.
Absolutely. Al, what would you toss off as a suggestion for this student and for many other students who had a very similar question?
It really fits into it goes hand in hand with what Ian said. Be passionate about what you're doing your documentary on. If you actually care about what you're doing and you are really passionate about the topic you've picked, which is why it's so important to pick a topic that you actually are interested in, that comes through in your storytelling. It'll come through in your scripts. It'll come through in how you put your storyboard together and how you eventually build your documentary, and it will truly bring out all of those aspects that Ian was talking about. So yeah, that's the big one for me. Make sure you really care and are invested in what you're doing. If you're bored with the topic you're doing, your audience is going to be bored with the topic you're doing.
I think that's a really good point. And in History Day, the way our score sheets are set up, it's 60% historical content, 20% clarity, 20% relation to theme, which is really argument. And you know, like we said, if you don't have a good story, if you don't have good research, if you don't have good sources backing you up, it falls apart. It doesn't matter how cool your special effect might be, because we've all seen some of those sci-fi movies, and let's be honest, we can name them, but we won't hear. Let's go. I've got a bunch of questions that have come in on pre-registration. We've got some on Twitter, and I'm going to start with a question for Al. Al, can you talk a little bit about the requirements for documentary, what students can and cannot do, so that they're real clear on what the expectations are at a contest?
Okay, it's 10 minutes. That's what you get for your documentary, and that is not 10 minutes of actual story. That is 10 minutes from the first image or sound you get until the last one you get. It includes your credits. It includes everything you throw into the documentary. So just kind of be careful with it. Don't go for any dramatic Star Wars-esque opening with some scrolling text that feeds into the sunset. That's going to kill your time. And when you get to your credits, if you did do the Star Wars-esque opening, don't speed past your credits to the point where nobody can read them. Give them some significant, I say significant, give them enough time to where they can be read. You want to credit who you're crediting, and make sure it can be seen. But just pay attention to where you're going with what. And kind of like Ian said earlier, make sure when you're editing that you edit it well, you realize what needs to be there and what doesn't. And then as Randy said, sometimes you're going to do some interviews that are 45 minutes, an hour long, and you might use one sentence out of that interview. But if it makes your documentary, if that one sentence is what you were looking for in the first place, then the other 45 minutes were totally worth it. So just make sure you're adhering first sound, first image to last sound / last image is what counts toward that 10-minute time limit.
That's important. And one of the rules that students sometimes struggle with is that they have to operate the equipment on contest day. Al, can you give some tips? Because if there's ever a technical meltdown at an NHD contest, it always happens in a documentary room. Can you give some tips to students so they can avoid the meltdown and the drama that can come with it?
Absolutely. Up until last year, or until this year, actually, I was an NHD sponsor for a high school here in Macomb, in Mississippi. So we always made sure to have multiple backups on multiple media for the documentary. For me, I'm a bit of a worrier, so I might have overdone it, but we never had a technical issue that cost us. So I would have a DVD copy, I would have a hard drive or jump drive copy, I would have a computer with a copy on it, and I'd have it either in my email, Google Drive, or YouTube, or all of the above. So that way, okay, jump drive doesn't work, well, I got a disk copy. Oh, you don't have a disk? Well, let's pull it up on YouTube. Oh, you don't have that? Let's just plug my computer in and do it that way. You got yourself covered if you go through, and what, a jump drive's $5 at Office Depot or Best Buy now? Go pick you one up. Discs are inexpensive. And the online media is free. I mean, YouTube, Google Drive, all of that's free to host stuff on and post stuff too, so you can access it easily. So just make sure you cover yourself by having a multitude of variety ways to show your doc.
Well, and keeping in mind, the judges want to see your product. By bringing it in multiple versions, if one doesn't work, you don't have to stress about it. You simply pull out the other one or turn off the laptop. There's nothing wrong with that. And that doesn't hurt you. The goal is that the judges want to see what you've produced. They're not so concerned what size screen they see it on. I have a question. I'm going to pass this question over to Randy. Sometimes students have, sent in questions that said, well, I'm working on the documentary and I found this great documentary. Can you use clips from documentaries that are already produced, and what would you tell students about using them?
Yeah, we have students do that quite often. I generally, at least my recommendation is that they strip the audio off and just use a little piece of someone else's footage with their own voiceover. I don't know if you or Al would agree with that. They find a lot of stuff on YouTube. Sometimes by the time a video gets uploaded to YouTube and compressed and put into Flash and then downloaded back out, the quality gets pretty ragged sometimes, so we've had some issues with that. And as I understand it, with NHD, as long as you're not going to show it for profit, that copyright is not an issue. Is that correct? It's fair use? I'm asking the experts here.
That is, I can tell you from the NHD perspective, it is educational fair use to use in private settings. So, for example, to play in a classroom or at a contest. However, I would warn that if you put someone's copyrighted material, whether that be music or documentary clips, up in a public setting like on YouTube, the person who owns the copyright does have the legal right to ask that it be taken down. But for private use and educational purposes, it's totally fair.
We have had Google's algorithms on YouTube nail a couple of our kids, and that, you know, their video went up without audio, so we're aware of that.
Okay. And it's also important to remember, too, any clip, if you want to use a clip, even if you just use the audio or even if you just use the video, it's really important that those go into that annotated bibliography where you explain, hey, I used the clip where the president gave this speech to show this perspective or this point of view. Here's a question. Ian, I'm going to pass this question to you. Sometimes one of our students asked, how do you make transitions in your documentary smooth? Because sometimes it's easy for those to get choppy where you go, let's say, from an intro to an argument or from part one of an argument to part two. What are some tips that you can give students to make those transitions a little smoother?
All right. Well, I think if I understand the question, I'm pretty sure it's not a question of like mechanically transitions like fades to blacks, but actually the story pivots and turning points. And I think a lot of times, if you're using narration, that you would use a transitional sentence in narration, one that connects idea A to idea. A lot of times, you know, it goes back to storytelling and story writing. The narration might use words, transitional words like meanwhile, at the same time, and although so and so didn't know this, what was happening miles away here in this other city was this, and that can kind of pivot the story in a narrative way. If you're doing a documentary where you're only relying on the interviews themselves without narration, that's a lot trickier, because then you're relying on your interviews to make the glue between the points, and those can be a little bit harder. So one of the techniques that I've utilizing text, sometimes you can dip to black and come up with a single word or a single idea. You don't necessarily have to come up and say chapter 3 with the theme heading, you know, reconstruction. You could come up with a quote, or you could come up with a single word that evokes the new theme that you're going to have, or it could be a statistic or a point of fact. I'm talking a little generally because I don't know what the story is in particular, but I feel like when the filmmakers are at that moment and they're trying to figure out how to glue the themes together, you know, say it's a traditional argument story, kind of in the introduction, point 1, point 2, point 3, conclusion, how to get from point 1 to point 2. Maybe a date, if it's chronologically driven, maybe just having a date will tell the audience, oh, now we're advancing through time. Maybe it's a quote. Maybe the quote introduces a new idea if it's kind of conceptually based. Maybe a statistic if you're switching into a new concept where qualitatively that might make more sense to your story. So what I would suggest to students to kind of sum that up is think about your story and think about what type of story there is and what are you trying to do when you're going from point A to point B to point C. What would be a nice uniting kind of glue to that? Dates, facts, statistics, quotes.
I think that gives a lot of different suggestions.
Yeah, but think of it so it creates artistically, and don't just use one and then use another one randomly another way and another one randomly another way, because then it starts actually becoming more hodgepodgey and less consistent. But if you have like a single concept that really fits with your storyline, it's going to look really elegant, and it's just going to be the icing on the cake, and it'll swing your audience with you through these different points.
Absolutely. Those are some good suggestions to do, to pick a method and to be consistent, because then it's going to help carry your audience through and help not confuse them. Al, here's a question. We talked earlier, we looked at an example where Ian used some reenactment as part of his documentary. And we get a lot of questions at NHD headquarters about, can I reenact this event or what happened? What are the rules about that?
The biggest thing is just to make sure it doesn't become too much of the documentary, because you are doing a documentary, not a performance. If you want the performance piece to be the focal point of your documentary, maybe you should consider performance. And that's not saying you can't include it. I've had students do it. I've seen very good documentaries that include the performance pieces. You just have to make sure it fits in the flow of what you're doing and that you're still telling the story through the documentary primarily. Or then, like I said, it just becomes kind of a performance on camera. So it's just kind of a way in the balance. I wouldn't make it too much of your doc. You still want to tell the story through your traditional documentary storytelling methods. So just kind of watch that. Ultimately, you want the documentary to be that, a documentary.
Absolutely. And also keep in mind the only students who can be involved in any way, shape, or form are those in the group. Because we get asked sometimes, can we put grandma on camera and have her read as the older woman? No, I'm sorry, you can't do that. And if it's not working, it's not working. Try it out, but if it's not working, stick to that documentary. Okay, I've got one last question here. And Randy, I'm actually going to pass this question to you. We get asked this all the time. Do you need to cite the images that you use in your documentary, in your bibliography, and in your credits? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, students often don't like to hear this, but yes, you have to cite every image, every clip, every audio file, everything. Now, of course, if a lot of those images come from the same archive or library or something, you can just cite the archive and mention in your annotation that you used, so many images from it. But yes, and it's also a perennial problem where, students will find an image on somebody's blog or, some 8th grader's website from Iowa or something, and it's, we're getting better at tracing those images back to their original source, so they can cite them from a credible source. And again, every year it comes up, I'll have someone cite, Google Images as their source, and I often say that, that would be like citing the librarian who handed you the book at the library as the source, so it's, yes.
Absolutely, and I think that's something that students are getting better at, but we have to just keep reminding them. You want to make sure it goes back to its original source, also because then it's a legitimate source. Photoshop is a whole lot of fun, and you can take a whole lot of historical heads and put them on different bodies in different times, so we want to make sure that what you're using is accurate and correct, because you don't want to make a mistake, because that would be bad.
But it's interesting how many historic photos that we've all seen a million times. I've been stumped trying to trace them back to a original source. It's a struggle.
It's definitely a challenge, but it's definitely a challenge we know that our NHD students can handle. All right, at this point, we are pushing on time, and I'm always pushing on time, but I just want to say thank you very, very much to Mr. Nissen and your students at Toledo Early College High School in Toledo, Ohio. Thank you, Al, one of our NHD and Mississippi coordinators. And I'm going to turn things over to Peter to wrap up the evening. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks again to all of our participants. And remember that NEH offers a variety of resources to NHD students and teachers, including Chronicling America, Excitement, and professional development programs for teachers. Also, don't forget your state humanities councils, many of which are also involved in NHD. I want to say one thing. Below the video screen you're watching this on, there's a survey on tonight's program. We welcome you to fill that out. And thank you so much. Good night.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening, and good luck with NHD 2016.